almost from the time of Constantine. After he died, Constantine was followed by the rule of his sons. His sons were officially Christian, which didn't keep them from trying to kill each other. And eventually they succeeded, leaving the empire to one of Constantine's nephews, a young man named Julian. Well, Julian had been raised in the palace of his uncle. Julian was given the finest Christian education. He had been a successful general under the leadership of his cousins, and when he became emperor, the first thing he did was to announce that he was not a Christian and was instead proudly what he called a Hellen. That is what we would call a pagan. Because of this, he's usually called Julian the Apostate, being someone who had gone against and renounced the faith that they had previously had. Now, Julian, as emperor, sets out to restore paganism to a position of power, or Hellenism, that is the religion of the Greeks, as he preferred to call it. He liked to think of himself as he would dress like a philosopher in long flowing robes. He grew his hair long and had a full beard to make himself look like a philosopher. But for him, philosophy involved quite a lot of what we call he was very interested in black magic. He was very interested in trying to tell the future. And according to people who knew him, he always smelled a little bit of blood because he was constantly sacrificing animals to various gods as ways of learning the future. While he was doing all of this, he also wrote extensively against Christianity and took steps to prove Christianity false, or so he thought. He decided that the temple in Jerusalem needed to be rebuilt and Judaism restored there. The reason being was that it was widely understood that the temple in Jerusalem would not be rebuilt until Jesus had returned. So if he could build the temple, if Jesus did not return, he would be able to prove to everyone that Christianity was false. Of course, he only began a building program he did not complete. Now, Julian, among his other ideas, thought that he was at least as great a military leader as Alexander the Great, and he decided that it was appropriate for him to invade and conquer Persia. At the time, there was peace between the two empires, so the Persians were somewhat surprised when Julian led the Roman army deep into Mesopotamia. He went right to their main capital, Ctesiphon, close to modern Baghdad, but was forced to retreat. In a final battle, he, like Alexander the Great, led the army from the front. Unlike Alexander the Great, he caught a spear and fell in the battle. Allegedly, his last words were either Vicisti Galilei or Nenika Kasmi, you have won, Galilean, before he passed. Now, with the emperor dead and stuck well inside Persian territory, his army had some choices to make. They immediately elected one of their officers, a man named Jovian, who was really distinguished most by his Christian piety, as the new emperor. And Jovian had one task as emperor, which was to make a peace with the Persians as quick as possible so everyone could get back home, which he did. Jovian doesn't rule for very long before he's passed, but from him onwards, the emperors are always Christians. Under Jovian and his immediate successors, Valens, Valentinian, Gratian, the empire is clearly ruled by Christians. The empire is becoming more and more Christian. Initially, they reverse from the policy of Julian, where Christianity is legal but paganism is on top, to one where all religions are tolerated, but Christianity is definitely the one in charge. However, within a few years, the religion that had formerly been the persecuted minority begins to become the powerful religion ruling the empire. In less than 20 years after Julian's death, the new emperor named Theodosius sets out to begin to end paganism. 382, he passes a series of laws. In Rome, the priesthood of the Vestal Virgins, a group of women dedicated to the service of the gods of Rome, find themselves no longer existing. Their temple is closed. The virgins themselves are forced to marry and no longer be virgins. The altar to the god of victory that had been in the Roman Senate is removed. From this point on, the emperors no longer have a role as pagan priests. Theodosius also bans the sacrifice of animals to the gods. At the same time, throughout the empire, there is the beginning of the destruction of paganism. Here is the head of a statue that had been in a temple honoring the goddess Aphrodite. And you can see how not only has she had her nose broken, but she's also had a cross carved into her head to remove any non-Christian spirit that might have inhabited the statue. Theodosius will continue to go further in the second series of laws a few years later. He abolishes all pagan priesthoods. He orders all temples to be closed. The eternal fire that burns in Rome is put out. In 391, he passes laws criminalizing telling fortunes, astrology, and practicing witchcraft. This, in some ways, can be seen as somewhat the end of a very, very long period. Under Theodosius, in 393, the last Olympic Games are held in Greece because, of course, they were organized around festival honoring the god Zeus. They will not begin again until 1896. In Egypt, the same laws are going into effect. In fact, it's in 394 under Theodosius that we get this inscription. This is the very last hieroglyphic inscription to be made because, of course, hieroglyphics were used in the religion of worship of the old gods of Egypt. Now that the old gods are forbidden, the system of writing their prayers begins to be lost. Within a very short time, knowledge of hieroglyphics will disappear. All religions in the empire that are not Christian, with the single exception of Judaism, are now illegal. It is a crime to worship any god other than the God of the Christians and Jews. Wrong forms of Christianity also become illegal. A lot of the, quote, lost gospels of early Christianity, books about other forms of Christianity that have been found come to us because they were buried in the deserts of Egypt at this time. All of these religions, variant forms of Christianity, disappear, at least in public. There are a few people still around who believe in the old gods, a few schools. In Athens, the academy founded by Plato continues to do the old-fashioned education, but it is very clear that it too is dying. Now, while the old order is dying, the new Christian culture is growing and prospering throughout the entirety of the 4th century. By the end of the 4th century, we will find bishops and churches in virtually every city. The new churches are built deliberately to serve for the worship of the Christian God. They follow Roman plans and are built in Roman style, but it is for the new religion. The cities become Christian, and while Christianity is now becoming the normal religion, it is also changing in itself as it moves away from being a religion limited to a few believers sharing the sayings of Jesus and passing them on. Now we see the real beginnings of Christian art. We see the beginnings of what's called the cult of the martyrs. That is, the idea becomes very widespread over the course of the 4th century that people who were killed earlier because of their belief in Christ, so had become martyrs, had in the afterlife a great deal of power. That prayers, intercessory prayers, that is, prayers to ask them to intercede with God, would be more likely to be answered, that objects associated with them, like their bodies, their clothing, things like that, carried clear spiritual power. These spread. There are other new things happening. Just as the last persecutions were happening, down in Egypt, a man named Anthony had decided that he wanted to seek a more spiritual life. He withdrew out into the desert of Egypt, living in a hut by himself. There, allegedly, he wrestled with the temptation of the devil, things like that. But he showed himself to be very, very spiritually pure. Other Egyptians, seeing him, wanted to live near him, and he began having followers around him. Well, Anthony did not like having followers, and living on the edge of the desert made it too simple. So he moved deeper into the desert. The followers came again. And finally, after this had gone on several times, he's told them that, look, if you want to, be with me, study my follow my spiritual path, you need to follow certain rules. And these men who do become the first Christian monks. Interestingly, there seem to have been some sort of Buddhist monasteries in Egypt until just a short period before this. Whether there's a direct connection or not, it's hard to say. But what we begin seeing from Anthony onwards is that young men, mostly, but also some women, particularly of the middle class and wealthier, begin dropping out of society to go live in the desert, in communities where they try to live the most purely Christian life they can. These monasteries will spread from Egypt to other parts of the empire, and by the end of the 4th century, there are people lamenting that so many of the best and brightest young people are choosing to go live in monasteries and avoid the world rather than taking part in society, having children, and so on and so forth. Because of course they are at least officially supposed to be practicing celibacy, and probably virtually all were. Now, as this culture becomes more and more intense, as we enter the 5th century, we see other people doing great acts of devotion. In Europe, in what's now France, there is a figure of Martin of Tours who goes around destroying the temples of the old gods. He goes and, establishing the first monasteries. He himself had become a Christian, fervent believer, while he had served in the Roman army under Julian the Apostate, and had renounced his position, giving up everything to follow Christ. Now, another one is a fellow named Simeon. Simeon Stylites, as he's called, lived in the area close to the modern city of Aleppo in Syria. There, he decided to go out into the countryside, and he found a pillar sitting isolated, climbed up on top of it, and began to do extreme acts of Christian devotion and didn't come down. Now, over time, the pillar on which he sat for about 30 years attracted people coming to see his devotions and listen to him preach. And soon, this remote site in northern Syria became the center for a permanent camp of people who had come to hear Simeon preach. Simeon would get up every morning and pray on top of the pillar. He had a bucket which brought him up food and took down his waste. So obviously he had people working with him throughout the years he was up there. And preached daily, many, many times. Now, with hundreds of people coming to hear him pray, other people take advantage of this and set up food stand places for people to stay, inns and hotels, soon there are restaurants and stores, all around. Simeon becomes very quickly probably the biggest celebrity in the Roman Empire. He has people coming to visit him, the emperor himself. People are come to hear him preach from as far as southern India and what's now England, as well as all points in between. He is considered the holiest man alive, and everyone wants to hear him. When he dies, the community that has grown up around his pillar has a problem. People are still interested, of course, in this great holy man. But how do they maintain a business? And they will build a church, the church you see in this picture, around his pillar. When it opens, it will be one of the largest churches in the world. It was massive at the time, and people will continue to come to this site where such a holy man had lived. Eventually, of course, his fame begins to fade, and while there are still Christians living in the immediate area of this church, it was long ago abandoned because people are no longer that impressed by a man sitting on top of a pillar for 30 years. Now, while this sort of thing is going on inside the empire, missions are beginning to leave the Roman Empire and going out to neighboring countries. Even before Constantine had become Christian, the kingdom of Armenia, wedged in the mountains between the Persians and the Romans, had become Christian. The Armenians begin to have a written language at this point. Under Constantine, a group of Syrian merchants on their way to India were shipwrecked on the coast of the kingdom of Axum along the Red Sea. They came into communication with Ezana, the king of Axum, or Negus Hanegus of Ethiopia, who became Christian. Ezana was a close ally to Constantine, worked with him, and had similar interests in spreading Christianity. Ezana will lead a Christian Axumite Ethiopian army to conquer Nubia. Nubia and Ethiopia are now also becoming Christians. Because they are Christian, they now look to the Roman emperor, who is also a Christian, as their great friend and ally. To the north, the tribe of the Goths begins to become Christian. There are growing Christian populations inside the Persian. Begin to have written languages. The Bible and prayers are translated into their languages. In Ethiopia, Ge'ez begins to be written. Bibles and so on are translated into Ge'ez, and we begin seeing long written inscriptions in Ethiopia. The Goths get their own written language, the first Germanic language to be written down, again brought by Christian missionaries. Now, while this is, from a religious viewpoint, a very exciting time where much is going, there are problems. For many people within the Roman Empire, especially in the West, the 4th century is a time of conflict. The empire as a whole is getting wealthier, recovering from the 3rd century crises, but the poor are not getting wealthy. The rich are getting incredibly wealthy. In the western part of the empire, it is not unusual to find entire provinces owned by just a handful of people who own everything. The former free people who had lived in the villages find themselves no longer owning their own land. They are now clients, sharecroppers, renting land that their families have always lived on. More and more in both country and city, the most important thing for a person to have, if they are working class or middle class, is some kind of relation with one of the rich and powerful, which is beginning to undermine some of the social cohesion. In the East, this is also happening, but nowhere near to the degree that it's going on. And it's also a period when religion is becoming something to fight about. Now that everyone is a Christian, and well, almost everyone is a Christian, there is less and less to fight against, you would think, except now the question that becomes most important is, what exactly do Christians believe? Fights over the nature of the Christian Trinity begin to lead to divisions within the church. The divisions within the church are often, if not always, as much political as they are spiritual in nature. Some of them will lead to new languages being written, as the people who are embracing these new or divisions within Christianity often want to build support among more ordinary people. So you will see the beginning of a new form of Egyptian called Coptic, written in an alphabet based on the Greeks. It will become the language of the Egyptian church, still used. Syriac, developed in Syria from the language Aramaic spoken there, still used by churches. Ge'ez, mentioned earlier, as well as Gothic. Curiously, I know of churches in our local area that use Coptic, Syriac, and Ge'ez in their services down to the present day, in October 2020 in metropolitan Atlanta. Now, this is a period when Christian art forms. And without being too over the top, a couple of things that are kind of interesting. The artists making Christian art will use images that are already known in their society. So on the left-hand side, we'll see, on the right-hand side, in extreme right, there is Moses from Egypt. Next to them are Isis and Horus, also from Egypt. Pictures of Mary the Mother with baby Jesus first emerge in Egypt, and they are very clearly modeled directly after images of Isis. Similarly, the picture on the left-hand side is not a Christian image. That is the god Apollo. And you can see very clearly how his image has been borrowed. Here, again, we have Apollo on one side and Jesus, the Good Shepherd, on the other. This image of Jesus as a Good Shepherd is one of the very first pictures of Jesus to survive. You'll notice he's missing the beard, the long flowing robes, most of the image of what we think of Jesus as looking like. Those will come later. They come in several forms. By the end of the 4th century, we're beginning to see the Jesus maybe we're more familiar with. Jesus with the long flowing hair and beard and robes. These are brought in because these are the stereotypical attributes of a teacher of philosophy. If you look back at the beginning of this is exactly how Julian the Apostate liked to have himself appear. Having Jesus with the long hair, the beard, the robe is suggesting Jesus too is a philosopher. You'll notice there is no particular racial attribute or ethnic attribute associated with these pictures of Jesus beyond what most of the people in the area where they were made would have looked like. And that classic Jesus, you can find Chinese Jesus, Jamaican Jesus, Irish Jesus, with the long hair, the full beard, and the robe. It is a costume, not a person. And sometimes we forget that. Here also, we see Jesus as a soldier, as a ruler. And finally, we find Jesus now having completely absorbed the philosopher costume. Jesus becomes the king, ruling over the heavens like a Roman emperor. Jesus has become all powerful. Christian art has become the dominant form throughout the whole of the Roman Empire. However, the Roman Empire is about to hit some of its worst times, even as Christianity completely triumphs.